Thanks for that, Deborah. Basically, I guess what I'd like to do for this session, folks, is build on a couple of the themes that I shared with you yesterday in the keynote. And I guess central, really, to this conference and central to our work here, and certainly my work back home in Ireland, is the whole notion of evidence-based practice. And I suppose I'm just going to share with you this morning some of the recent work and recent initiatives that we've been doing really to develop the whole notion of emotional resilience and well-being in our most vulnerable young people. I guess normally when I do a workshop, I have about 20 people in it, and it's super interactive, and I can't really see people, so it's not going to be super interactive, but I apologize for that. But I think, we'll take some questions afterwards. If there's other discussions or debates, maybe we can link up outside. I guess just to share with you a couple of key textbooks that I lugged across halfway across the world. So I said I'm not going to let them sit in a hotel room because it took up half my luggage allowance. So I'm going to share them with you this morning. And I suppose I've also put together a set of resources and reading lists, Deborah, which I forgot to mention yesterday. They're going to be available as well. So there's a pretty extensive reading list. There's a number of key books, I guess, that I particularly like that have really, I suppose, shaped practice and shaped the way we do our work. Practical Guide to Mental Health Problems in Children with Autistic Spectrum Disorder. Really, really nice book. It's on the reading list, as I say, but it's one that I find particularly good. There's a range of other ones which probably are a little bit more UK specific. Mental Health and Autism, again, it is translatable. So there's a range of readings here that we can share later on. They're on the reading list, they'll be in the resource pack, etc. The one book, and I'm going to do a bit of PR here for David now, that I really like is David's book, Mental Health of Children and Adolescents with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And this is a really, really useful read. We have it on our reading list in terms of our ClinPsych training program at home, and it's a very, very practical guide, and it's a book I really like, and certainly when myself and Barry Carpenter did work with the ministry in Adelaide last year, that was one of the key readings. So again, they're on the resource list. One of the, I suppose, the significant pieces of work that we've done over the last couple of years with a number of colleagues, particularly Barry Carpenter in the UK, I guess one of the key messages when we've gone to schools and when we've spoken to teachers and family members and colleagues is a real need for education and training around the whole area of mental health and emotional well-being. And that comes at us every single time we visit schools and we have conversations with colleagues. So I guess building on the Complex Learning Difficulties and Disabilities report, Professor Barry Carpenter got quite significant funding from the UK government to develop a set of online resources and online materials specifically around the whole notion of complex need. And I guess I was involved in one of those particular modules around mental health and emotional well-being. And you can see the address here. It's www.complexneeds.org.uk. The very good news is, I guess, all the resources to do with that module and that set of materials, they're all free, they're readily downloadable, and they're very, very accessible. So I'm just going to take you on a very, very quick tour of, I guess, some of our thoughts prior to developing the module, working with colleagues, I guess, in special ed, in specific, ASD services, etc. And just give you a little bit of a sense, I suppose, of what those materials are about. And as I say, the good news is they are free and readily accessible, and the address is there. So just a little bit of a backdrop, I guess, to the whole development of this, and I suppose this really emphasizes this whole notion of evidence-based practice that we've heard so much about both this morning in some really interesting sessions and also yesterday. And I guess as part of our work, as part of our research, but very much guided by certainly clinical practice, was the whole notion of, there is a changing pattern of childhood disability. we are seeing young children in our classrooms, in our clinics, that we haven't seen the likes of their complexity before. And certainly in the keynote yesterday, I mentioned some of those around rare chromosomal disorders, specific mental health difficulties, huge issues around FASD, and obviously autism spectrum disorder, which I mentioned again yesterday. And again, one of the key messages that we keep hearing from staff is, we really, and this, I suppose, in particular comes from education staff, teachers in particular, who are in there working with these young people day in, day out. We need upskilling, and we need information on, what are the implications of working with complex ASD? What is the implication if I have a child in my classroom who has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? What do I do with them? I don't have information. So I guess this is the one message that has been coming to us over the last couple of years since we've been doing this work and engaging in lots of practice around it. So to say, it was a funded project by the UK government. One of the, I think, particularly nice things about it is while it's developed in the UK, I mean, I use it in Ireland in terms of my clinical practice. Our ClinPsych trainees are involved in it. I suppose we've travelled the world, and it's not just specific to the UK. And I think you can contextualise it for your own particular country and your own particular set of policies and procedures maybe that you have in place. So I guess what we wanted to do was develop a set of materials that, number one, were easily accessible. They were going to be free for people, and that weren't going to be overly academic in terms of their content. There was lots and lots, and there is lots and lots of really, some useful, some not so useful information online. Some of it is very, very accurate. Unfortunately, some of it is not. And what we often find in conversations with teachers and families is some of the information that they're accessing, it simply isn't evidence-based, and there's no rationale to back it up. And I suppose that was the one thing that certainly in terms of developing the emotional well-being module was this absolutely has to be evidence-based, has to be based on sound principles, etc. And I suppose what we really wanted to do was it to be pretty interactive in terms of your practice, while it is developed for teachers and educators, I think certainly the feedback we're getting is, it is as useful to our ClinPsych trainees or other colleagues in occupational therapy, social work, and indeed families. So, we also do lots of workshops with families around the whole notion of emotional well-being and mental health, and these set of resources are as useful. So I guess given the changing pattern of childhood disability, given some of the complexities that we're seeing in terms of our practice, and we're also doing some really interesting research around that, we want to develop a set of resources that people could readily access. And I guess, what we really want to emphasize was developing resilience and developing emotional well-being. So yes, we do talk about diagnostic frameworks, and yes, we do talk about specific interventions. The role of the module and the series of modules isn't to make you expert in this area, but it's to give you a grounding or a starting place in terms of, I have this young person in the classroom setting and I really don't know what to do with them. I'm trying to make sense of some of the difficulties that I'm seeing, but I'm not sure what those difficulties may be in relation to. Could be anxiety, could be depression, could be a trauma, could be some attachment-related issue. And as I say, embedded within the module at various levels are reading lists, there's reflective questions, there's kind of think tank type group discussion. And I guess that was very much what we would like to do, was to develop this whole school philosophy around emotional resilience and building emotional literacy. So it's not just, while it's aimed at an individual, certainly the way we've been rolling it out in the UK and certainly in terms of special ed schools is it's been very much a whole school philosophy. So the entire school has taken this on board. And I mentioned yesterday the notion of a well-being team. And certainly that's a pretty new concept, certainly in the UK, where the vast majority of our work has been happening. And they've really, these well-being teams that are being set up, they're just simply tapping into the resources that we've shared with them, and being able to access that and get good information from it. So some of the underpinning assumptions of this particular work, obviously we wanted it to be practice-led. So again, you guys are the educators or the professionals in the field. So we did lots of liaison with a range of multidisciplinary staff. As I mentioned, it absolutely needed to be evidence-based. So there's lots of readings and resources and other links that are embedded within the module. As I say, we were very, very careful in terms of making sure that they were, if there are articles in there, that they're peer-reviewed and they're methodologically sound, needed to be inquiry-focused, and obviously needed to be research-informed. And ultimately, I suppose, it needed to be usable for teachers who obviously are in very busy classrooms, working with very complex young people, etc. So we tried to cater for as many of the needs as we could, given the piloting scheme that we engaged in. And I suppose for me as a module manager or a leader in terms of trying to develop this set of resources, one of the things I suppose that I constantly kind of grappled with was how do we actually create a set of materials that is actually going to capture the attention of our target audience, i.e. predominantly teachers and educators. And I suppose the way the module has evolved, has been very much, this is about practice, this is about you in the classroom, perhaps at times scratching your head wondering, what do I do with this young student? So at least, you can go to a set of resources and say, well, perhaps maybe, if I look at the particular piece around anxiety and see what some of the physiological symptoms are, maybe that might make sense to me in terms of working with this young student. Again, embedded within this are a series of case studies, which are very, very real. We've worked with these young people, and I guess, case study work is hugely important, and I think that's really where a lot of the learning takes place. And I suppose we want to have multiple perspectives on case studies. So not alone did we want to have a teacher focus in terms of that, but we also wanted to hear what the family member, the mum and the dad, were saying about their son or daughter. These are the difficulties I'm having within the home context. So again, the other perspective, I guess, was that of the health or the education professional. So again, we maybe are coming at this from a very, very different perspective. We're coming into the school for sessional basis, we're coming in observing, but ultimately we're observing the same child in a range of different contexts. So I say embedded within that are a series of case studies, which again are downloadable. And again, I suppose what we recommend is that these are used, in terms of group style reflective practice. And I think that's where the real learning takes place. Again, I like the notion of the jigsaw, because very often when we're working with these young people with very, very complex needs, we have certain information, but we don't have an entire picture very often. And as I say, sometimes when there's pieces of the jigsaw missing, it can be hard to make sense of the difficulties that we're actually observing. And I think that's just a nice way of looking at it in terms of a model of understanding. And again, it's driven by the interest of the people accessing the website, driven by curiosity. So I have a young person in the school or in my classroom with very, very complex ASD or an FASD. What do I do? What kinds of teaching strategies do I engage in the classroom to try and maybe develop this notion of emotional resilience, etc. So it's very much driven by that practice-focused perspective. I suppose within the module there's a series of levels. There's 4 levels in total. And I suppose depending on where you are in terms of the ladder or what your interest is in terms of mental health or emotional well-being, you can dip in and out of the various levels as you see fit. So you can see on the screen here just various definitions of the various levels. So for example, if perhaps you're a school principal or a deputy head, you may actually be interested just in level D, which is the area of whole school approaches to promoting emotional well-being or emotional resilience, or indeed staff well-being. We heard some really interesting presentations yesterday around the notion of emotional well-being, not just for the student, but also for the staff. There's information in there. Perhaps I'm a very, very new educator or teacher, very, very new to practice. I may start off at the very much the introductory level. And I may not know a huge amount about mental health or emotional well-being. That's literally the first rung of the ladder. It will give you some very, very basic information around, what is a mental health difficulty, what way is it defined, what kinds of classification frameworks might we be using, etc. And it builds as we go down the various levels. But you can dip in and out as you see fit. Some important issues, I guess, when we were actually developing each of the modules, and as I say, I specifically developed in conjunction with my colleague Tina Ray in the UK, the emotional well-being one. There's a range of other modules which I'll share with you now, again, that you can dip in and out of. So you don't have to start off with this notion of emotional well-being or mental health. Perhaps as part of your training, you didn't get a huge amount of information around child development, or maybe you did, and you need to recap on some of that. There's lots of other modules in there, again, that you can dip in and out of. So a couple of important considerations. We didn't want to make this a resource that was very, very academic heavy. And that, just literally relied on heavy textbooks, peer reviewed articles. They're in there, and you can dip into them as you see fit. But I suppose we wanted to make it very, very user-friendly. Across the levels, A to D, I suppose we wanted to be very, very flexible, but obviously there needed to be significant linkage across the various levels so that you could dip in and out, or you could start at level A and work through B, C, and end up at level D. And I suppose we really wanted to stress and emphasize, I suppose, the appropriateness of each of the levels. There was no point having, level A at such a level that it was incomprehensible. It needed to be able to draw in the person who was accessing it and bring them along a journey, essentially. That's what our aim and our objective was around it. The website address is, as I mentioned earlier, complexneeds.org.uk. There are 16 modules in total, and as I say, the module that I specifically was involved in was the one specifically around mental health and emotional well-being. This is essentially for want of a better word, this is the first page that you'll see when you actually access that site. And I think it's a pretty user-friendly site. We worked with Real Group, who are a bunch of guys in the UK who know special education and they know technology, so it was actually a nice mix because, again, that was one of the key things. We didn't want a website or a set of resources that was simply unmanageable and simply not user-friendly. For busy teachers, professionals, educators, family members, mums and dads, they need to be able to get access to it, download some useful information, take it away, read it on an iPad, whatever the case may be. So you can see here there's a study planner tool, so you can actually do this in a very, very structured way, or like I said earlier, you can dip in and out of it as you see fit. Certainly in terms of the work that we've done in developing wellbeing teams in some of the special schools that we worked with, we do recommend using the study planner tool, and it's done in quite a systematic and structured way. Or alternatively, you can just choose a module, dip in and out as you see fit. So you can see here the range of modules is on the screen. It's pretty diverse. It's, I think, to be very honest, it's as applicable in terms of Australia as it is in New Zealand, the UK, the States, etc. The only piece probably that you would certainly need to have a look at is, section 1.2 there, the legislative context, because obviously policies and procedures will be different across continents and worldwide. And I suppose my colleagues certainly in Adelaide, they're now looking at this particular set of resources, but they're contextualizing it to be very specific to their needs. And that's readily achievable, I think. So this is how it looks. It's a snapshot, so it's not particularly readable here. But basically, Module 3.4 is on emotional well-being and mental health, and this first screenshot, as it were, gives you the option that you can actually download the entire module if you want to put it on an iPad or a laptop or whatever the case may be. If you don't, for example, have access to the internet, either at home or at school or elsewhere. And basically how it's laid out, I suppose, is in terms of, obviously we have our levels, but then embedded within each level are what we call, or what Real Group decided to call them, was a series of packages. So you can see here in the left-hand column, there's all these little drop-down menus. So here we're looking at all levels, so you can see A, B, C, and D, but then under each of those, you can see here, level or package 1, healthy bodies, healthy minds, dealing with difficult times, dealing with mental health indicators, etc., anxiety. So that's how the entire package across all 16 modules is laid out. So if you pick, for example, level D, so you're interested in whole school approaches to promoting this notion of mental health and emotional well-being, there'll be a very specific series of packages that will drop down and that you can work through. And then generally at the bottom of the screen, you can see there, again, this is UK specific and these are UK policy documents. Obviously not all are specific to the UK, so we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, etc. But there are further readings, there are video clips, there are reflective questions, etc. for each of the various levels. So I guess in terms of level A, this very much was an introductory package to this notion of mental health and well-being. And I suppose what we wanted to get people thinking about was the very notion of mental health. What is it? How do we define it? And build on that as the packages go through. Well, now that we know a little bit about what mental health is, how do we begin to have some conversations with colleagues in the classroom and maybe in the entire school around promotion of emotional well-being or mental health? What is this notion of resilience? And again, that's embedded within the various packs as you go through that journey. So this is just a typical kind of, again, a snapshot of a series of questions, and again, I suppose coming from a clinical psychology background, the notion of reflective practice I think is hugely important, and maybe that's something that not a huge amount of schools engage in. Again, people get caught up with the busyness of teaching, etc., but sometimes it's good to step out of that and actually maybe have a half day or a full day around this notion of well-being. What does it look like in the classroom? What might it actually look like in terms of a whole school philosophy? Maybe do we even have a policy around well-being? And if we don't, maybe that's the first step for our school in terms of building resilience. And that's certainly very much kind of I think the role of the well-being team that I mentioned yesterday. They take ownership of that. And they begin to look at ways that they can actually have those conversations with students in the classroom, with teachers in the classroom, and with the whole school. And it is working quite effectively. Again, here's another reflective question. Mental health indicators. What are some of the signs? And again, here we're asking, think of a child in your classroom that you may have some concerns about. Not really sure what some of those concerns are, but at least you're questioning and the awareness is there that there's something not right here. Young Johnny in the classroom 6 months ago was happy, was carefree, loved going out playing soccer and engaging with his peers, etc. Now we're seeing a very different pattern emerging. He's not engaged in those kind of behaviors anymore. Why is that? So again, those reflective questions are really important in terms of the first step, in terms of that journey of trying to understand what these difficulties are. Again, throughout, I think the 2 days of the conference, we've heard huge amounts of discussion and debate around, obviously, this notion of anxiety and indeed other mental health difficulties, but for some of us, maybe, we haven't any training around what are the signs of anxiety? How would we know if someone in our classroom was anxious? Suppose that young person has a complex ASD and perhaps they're not particularly verbal or they have, limited communication skills. What are the kinds of things that we might need to think about in terms of their emotional resilience? And again, very, very good question. What is anxiety and how can you actually tell if someone is anxious? And again, it will give you just very, very basic information around what an anxiety or an anxiety disorder, we don't particularly label it as an anxiety disorder per se, but what is anxiety? Anxiety sometimes can affect us all. And how does that affect us? And how might it affect the individual student within your classroom? Would that be any different? So, we give very, very clear definitions around that, and then perhaps list some of the common types of signs or indeed symptoms that we might see. Dry mouth, sweating, maybe butterflies in the stomach, whatever language you'd like to use. And I suppose that notion of language and terminology was important in terms of developing the module. We didn't want it to be overly technical, so we tried to use as user-friendly language as we possibly could. And again, further reflective questions. Think of a child that you may know in the classroom, maybe who has a diagnosis of anxiety, or there is a query around the anxiety. How do they actually communicate that to you? What happens if they don't have the verbal skills to be able to tell you about those subjective elements of my heart is racing or I have butterflies in my stomach? What are the behavioral type indicators that we may then need to use? So linkage across and between modules, as I mentioned earlier on, is important. And again, we're just dipping in and out of the various modules. There's a really, really useful module there on neuroscience. And I guess in the UK, there's a recently formed neuroscience forum where neuroscientists, some of which from the University of London and the Institute of Psychiatry, they're now having conversations with their special education colleagues. They're interested in going to classrooms, and equally special educators are interested in the kind of research that these guys are engaged in. I mean, that I think is a huge step forward in terms of our research agenda, and also I suppose in terms of the future of those young people with complex need. So again, perhaps if you want to dip into the notion of child development and look at some of Piaget's stuff or look at some other basic child development, you can just dip into that module, gather some information, get some reading done, and then go on and look at some of the other modules or dip back into mental health. The child development module, again, starts off from a very, very, what I would consider, a basic understanding of what is child development, who are some of the significant theorists, as an educator and as a teacher, what might I need to know about typical child development? Because obviously in understanding atypical development, we first need to understand, milestones and typical development. It's all in here in the various packs. And again, laid out in exactly the same way. So again, our levels are on the main screen, but here we have our packages and a series of resources then attached to each of those. And again, you can see here, when we think about growth and development, the various stages that we may need to be looking at. So, for example, you may be teaching adolescents, so you may just decide to dip into that particular package or that set of resources. Or you may want, to dip into the younger kids, from birth to 1 year, just to get a sense, again, typically developing children, what are the milestones we'd be expecting to see, etc. And I suppose embedded again within that, typical development, the notion of obviously having an intellectual or a learning difficulty, what are the kind of the early warning signs that we might be expecting to see, and again that's drawn from lots of the literature in terms of early intervention from a multidisciplinary perspective. Professor Carpenter himself wrote the module around engaging with families and the family journey, again, which is so important. And again, I think one of the hugely important things is listening to the voice of family. And it's not just the mums and the dads, but maybe in the current climate, there's grannies and granddads and uncles and aunts involved. So it's very much about the extended family and siblings and others who may be in that circle of family for the young person. And again, you can see here there's actually interviews with family members embedded within this. And again, these are really, really powerful quotes that we're seeing, and really, really powerful stories that we're seeing from families, who are struggling with services, who are struggling with teachers and educators in schools, and are sometimes, struggling to even make sense of, well, my son or daughter may have a disability, they may have an autism spectrum disorder, and now here we're talking about yet another layer of complexity, this notion of some kind of a mental health difficulty. So again, similar to what I discussed yesterday around those layers of complexity, sometimes that can be an absolute minefield for families. So I think something like this, which is written in a very user-friendly way, can be sometimes very, very useful for family members and indeed siblings to dip in and out of. Again, there's a package there around quality of life. What is quality of life? How do we actually define it? Very, very very difficult concept to define, because again, it depends on our own individual experiences, how we envisage or how we view quality of life. So my quality of life may be very, very different to somebody else's. And how, I suppose, do we look at quality of life maybe for some of our most complex students who actually can't tell us what they would like or what their needs are. But again, we need to develop ways of behavioral indicators around that. So again, you can dip in and out. Level B then, obviously, you've gone through the basic information and the introductory information around mental health and well-being. And I suppose we're getting slightly more into, how might we actually recognize anxiety? How might we recognize some of the signs of depression, etc.? We go through definitions, and again, that might sound overly simplistic, but again, with any concept, it's hugely important to be very clear and have very, very clear definitions of what we want and what we're actually understanding with these complex phenomena. Obviously, early detection and identification, that's one of the things, I guess, that is really, really important in that, for any practitioner, they'll invariably tell you sometimes when they are called to case conferences or review meetings, when you actually trace back some of these difficulties, we actually should have been involved much, much earlier. And unfortunately, we all get called to these crisis team meetings and case conferences, etc. So I suppose part of our hypothesis or our aim around some of this work that we're doing in terms of the module and the training is really to equip people to pick up on some of those early warning signs much earlier than we have been doing before. So as I say, it's not to make you expert, in terms of diagnosing, but at least recognize there's something here that's amiss, that's a little bit different, and we're really struggling to make sense of it. So maybe we need to have some discussions with colleagues at this point, rather than 6 months down the road. Again, we talk about protective, we talk about lots of risk factors, and again, reflective questions around each of those various levels. So how can school-based staff currently screen for these risk and resilience factors? How would you even know the child may be at risk? Level C then, again, focuses on the identification of mental health difficulties and the impact at an individual level, impact on the family, and obviously, we're beginning to delve into the territory of the whole school approach, and what does that mean to actually have a whole school approach around this notion of well-being. We talk again in a little bit more detail here around diagnosis and what's actually involved. So we talk about, at the time it was obviously DSM-4. We are talking certainly about revising the materials now, because obviously the world of research is evolving quite rapidly. So our plan really every kind of 1.5 to 2 years is to update the materials. We now obviously have DSM-5, so that makes a significant difference in terms of our diagnostic frameworks. School staff and the diagnostic process. And again, I suppose one of the things that we always value and benefit from are conversations with the teachers who are in the school, teaching these young people. and the evidence that they bring to the table and the information that they bring to the table for us as clinicians is hugely, hugely important. So the voice of not alone mums and dads and family members, but the voice of the teacher within the classroom is hugely important in terms of that diagnostic information that we gather. And again, what is the role of the teacher? And again, embedded in here is actually case study material that will actually draw out and expand upon, well, here's a case study, here's a young person that we worked with, and here's how we engaged with the teachers, school principals, and other members of the team. Again, we now begin to talk about this notion of social skills and how might these make a difference to the young person. And in fact, what are social skills and how might they make a difference in terms of their effectiveness? And we also begin to talk about intervention strategies. And here, obviously, mentioned yesterday very, very briefly around the notion of cognitive behaviour therapy. We've certainly heard lots of speakers over the last 2 days in terms of the workshops, giving us some really, really good evidence that, strategies such as cognitive behaviour therapy and indeed other strategies such as mindfulness and behavioural strategies work very, very well. Obviously, we need to be cautious around, assessing for readiness to engage in this, so it doesn't suit everyone, and that's certainly the case in terms of the general population, but there is certainly an emerging literature base out there to say that actually, as an intervention strategy, cognitive behaviour therapy works. So literally, here is some information on what cognitive behaviour therapy is, and there's also some readings attached to that to give you a better understanding. So perhaps the student in your classroom is actually, seeing a psychologist or a mental health professional, and this will give you a little bit of a sense of maybe the kind of work that they're engaged in. And again, we're not just focusing on cognitive behaviour therapy. There's a range of other treatment approaches or intervention strategies that are out there. Again, there is information on those and the emerging literature base that's attached to them. And our plan is to update this so that, as the research evolves and as the evidence-based practice evolves, it can be embedded within the module. Deborah. Very much moves to a far more whole school approach. So, you've looked at the definitions, you've begun to understand a little bit about what mental health is, how it may impact upon the individual student, how it may impact upon the family, how it may impact upon the individual student in the classroom, and some maybe strategies and resources that you can, draw down on to work with that individual student. But in terms, if this notion of resilience and building resilience is actually going to work within the school context, what do we as a school need to be actually doing? And as I say, there's very, very specific information in there around this notion of whole school approaches to building resilience. And again, models of understanding. So I suppose within any framework of understanding and within any whole school approach, it does need to be evidence-based and have sound theoretical foundations. So as I say, you're simply building on the information that you've learned in terms of this journey. And I suppose, looking at policy development within the school and perhaps also looking at research initiatives which will guide that policy and obviously guide the practice of those working within the school or indeed beyond it. There's information in there, I suppose, more generically around health promotion. So, in schools elsewhere without the presence of a disability, how have those schools actually, what have they done to promote the notion of well-being? And how can we actually take some of the lessons learned maybe from those schools and apply them to our particular context? So like I mentioned yesterday, it is about adapting and it is about being a little bit creative maybe in terms of the work that you're actually doing. And again, very, very briefly, I touched on the notion of leadership yesterday. Very specific information in here around this notion of leadership. And I suppose, it can be a top-down approach, but equally it can be a bottom-up approach. And I think that was very much the philosophy that we were working with, in terms of the development of some of these well-being teams and operationalizing that, so you actually have staff on the ground who are interested and motivated in this notion of well-being, but obviously from a top-down approach, school principals, etc., are interested in policy. So the two can meet quite nicely in terms of developing these notions. And again, I suppose the million-dollar question for a lot of us, if we don't have a school policy, obviously, we need to develop one. Where to next? What things do we need to be mindful of? And I guess, the bottom line to that, and certainly when we've worked with schools, is ongoing training and ongoing continued professional development. And I think that's hugely important. So, every 3 to 6 months, depending on the schools that we work with, we'll revisit the school. And maybe there's some further training that we need to engage with the staff. Or maybe the well-being team have come so far, but, they're a bit stuck in terms of the next steps. And sometimes it just takes that outside perspective to actually get a sense of the school and the school culture, I think, which is hugely important, and to be able to problem solve with the well-being team so they can then take ownership and build on that. And obviously then finally monitoring and evaluation. So if we are introducing initiatives within the school, how do we actually know if they're going to be effective or not? And over time, how do we know this is actually going to make a difference to the lives of the students within the classroom, or indeed the culture of the school more specifically? And certainly there's lots of information and lots of resources embedded within that will guide you. Again, some of them may need some adaptation because they simply won't be applicable as they are for maybe your particular school or elsewhere. So it's about taking those and maybe adapting them to meet your needs. And finally then, before I finish, again, we had a really interesting presentation yesterday from, I think, Tom Tutton, Deborah's colleague, specifically looking at this notion of teacher mental health. So I think when we develop whole school philosophies and policies around mental health, we're not just talking about the individual students. We're actually talking about a much broader perspective. These young people sometimes are very complex, and they are certainly challenging to work with, and they present us with many challenges. So the notion of, your own mental health, is massively important. And I think that's a really central feature of any whole school approach. And obviously developing policy around that. And again, within that, developing almost a whole school approach, developing a mental health plan for your school. What would that even look like? How would we even start that process? And this is some of the very much the introductory work that we do with the well-being team around, what's the philosophy of the school? What would you guys like to actually get from developing some kind of a policy or a strategy around resilience and well-being? And we take it from there, because each school invariably will be very, very different and will have a different ethos and a different philosophy, and you have to appreciate that. So again, it's about being a little bit creative and a little bit adaptive in terms of that work. Interagency collaboration, obviously essential. There's probably a range of people here from different disciplines. Schools are liaising constantly with clinicians and other health and education professionals. And that notion of real transdisciplinary work, hugely important. And as I say, meaningful dialogue and meaningful collaboration is hugely important within that. And I think that's, again, one of the nice things about this series of modules is there's a vast range of people who have written them. Educators, clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, family members have been on board. And I think that really is something that's really important. So I think probably, Deborah, I'm going to finish up at that. We're just coming up on time. So again, the information is online. There's lots of information there. What essentially you got this morning was very much a snapshot of how really to look at evidence-based information and translate that into a series of modules or teaching modules that will at least enable people to get information and sound, reliable information in terms of guiding their practice. So thank you for that.